This is part two of Introduction to Agent-Based Modeling for Large-Scale Systems. Last time we discussed a few of the concepts, breezed over them, looked at some tools, and provided some resources and some references for you to search on the web. Today we're going to discuss design and analysis of agent-based modeling and simulation systems. We're going to cover agents, the environments that they inhabit, the policies, behaviors of agents, interactions, and the kind of measurements that you might want to do in your simulation. So obviously the first step you have to take is to do your domain research. You need a clear-cut problem statement, the background on the domain, and a pretty good idea of what phenomenon you want to capture in your model. Then you have to describe the environment adequately, identify the agents, look at the phenomenon that you would like to capture at different scales, determine the actions, the events, the policies of the agent actors, and then measurements and statistics. Once you have a good idea of the domain and the elements in the domain, you have to decide what kind of model or simulation you want to produce. One of the first choices that you have is to either use a deterministic or a stochastic basis for your simulation. Stochastic simulations generally capture the uncertainties and incomplete information, and most of the simulations have some element of Monte Carlo or stochastic representations in them. Next, you have to decide what the actual rules and laws of the domain will be. There are different rules for physical systems. Obviously, you have physics to deal with to some degree. Social systems have cultural norms, language, interaction. Economic systems clearly have issues of cost, flow, supply, demand. Organizational systems have to do with structure and task and workflow. So there's various kinds of domain elements that will help you determine the kind of simulation. And moreover, you have to really be careful about what the goals of the simulation are. You have to decide what data and information you're going to present as a result of the simulation, and make sure that the simulation captures that data. Now, in general, there is no formal methodology associated with design analysis of ABMS, but most experienced researchers have some sort of codified approach. And moreover, most of the researchers tend to work in a particular domain, their domain of expertise. And in these domains, there are common representations and tool sets that will guide and sometimes constrain the modeling and simulation activity. In general, the most successful approach in using the current tools is to engage in an exploratory process and do some sort of iterative refinement. Iterative refinement in the context of agent-based modeling and simulation is somewhat reversed. Usually, as engineers, we're taught to do a hierarchical decomposition in a top-down fashion. This is the so-called reductionist approach. You take the system, you break it down into subsystems, break that down into subsystems, analyze the interactions at each layer, and when you reach the bottom, whatever that might be, you're finished. In agent-based modeling and simulation, the approach is to do a bottom-up composition of the system, an anti-reductionist approach, where you're relying on capturing the very fundamental and hopefully simple behaviors of a set of primitive agents, and then allowing the organization at various levels to emerge based on the interactions of these agents. So at this point, we're going to begin to introduce an example problem that Shannon Spires is going to go into in the next lecture in great detail. But we'll, as we go through this approach to modeling and simulation, we'll provide examples from the so-called neo-Luddite world that Dennis has talked about. So this is a problem statement, fairly terse. The idea is that terrorist insurgency of neo-Luddites has arisen among a population in a city occupied by a foreign power, the Techies. The city is patrolled by counterinsurgency troops who will detain or shoot the neo-Luddite insurgents on site, occasionally accidentally killing the native inhabitants. The neo-Luddite terrorists have undertaken a bombing campaign in the city. They're targeting CI troops, but there's also collateral damage in terms of their encounters as well. And occasionally they kill the neutral inhabitants. Neutral inhabitants are the source of terrorists in this case. They convert at some unknown constant rate, generally attributed to their anger at being occupied by a foreign occupation. Intelligence indicates also that the recruitment process seems to increase, the rate increases, when an event in which neutrals are killed by either CI or NI combatants occurs. There is some evidence that in this problem statement that CI training, propaganda, and relief work seem to decrease the recruitment levels. Now, because these are complex adaptive entities, recently the insurgents have innovated in response to their decreasing numbers by building bigger bombs. The counterinsurgency has a problem here. It's not clear whether adding more troops will be an effective counter strategy. They're constrained because if the casualty rate gets too high, the homeland citizens will demand withdrawal of the troops. So a critical situation exists, and we need help determining a strategy. Should we add more troops, increase the influence operations, train the troops to better distinguish terrorists from neutral, improve lethality? So in general, we need to understand the complex interactions among the agents and the events. So I'm going to capture some important variables. The most important variable in this problem statement, as we're choosing, is the populations and their densities, the number of counterinsurgency troops, the number of neutrals, and the number of insurgents alive and dead. And there are bounds on all. There are ceilings. You can't have too many in one small space. And there's clearly an important threshold on the counterinsurgent death rate. You capture physical events. There's shootings. There's explosions. You want to capture the power, the radius, the effect on humans. This affects the deaths and the death rates of all of the agents. The shootings, the accuracy, the effect on humans, collateral damage, that affects the rates of the insurgents and the neutrals. There are some social events embedded in the problem. The response of the neutral population to occupation. This affects their constant background recruitment rate. The response of the neutral population to influence operations. This affects constant recruitment rate as well. And also the response of the neutral population to deaths, to events. This affects excursion in the recruitment rate. And finally, there's an immigration into the system of neutrals from outside of the environment, and this affects the number of neutrals. And then finally, there are military events, or events associated with military doctrine, increasing troop levels, which affects the death rate of all of the entities. Improving troop rules of engagement decreases the deaths of the neutrals. Improving troop intelligence, the ability to identify terrorists, non-terrorists, decreases the deaths of neutrals and the counter-insurgents. And also improvements in influence operations, which decreases the constant recruitment rates. So this is a complex system. It's not purely physical or social or military. It's a hybrid simulation, typical of the kind of thing you want to capture in an agent-based model. So the first thing that you got to do in modeling these is identify a primitive set of agents. And what you're looking for here is the most primitive unit of causation, the lowest level, and you'll call these your agents. These are going to be the basic building blocks for doing the bottom-up development. So remember, you have to make sure that the entities you choose at the primitive layer qualify for being agents. Our definition from last time is an independent locus of sensing, decision, and action. So you could say they have to be sentient, to some extent intelligent and autonomous. Again, the meaning of those words is somewhat in question. But so often an agent distinction is obvious from the real-world environments. Particularly like social models, human beings are generally the primitive agents associated with social models. But agents can be entirely abstract. If you're inventing worlds or you're trying to produce a simulation of ephemeral things like software, they may be entirely abstract. Now remember, agents should have some basic characteristics. First of all, they should have some causal influence on the environment, including other agents. They should be active in some sense, that they will respond to stimuli produced by other agents or objects in the environment. They have to be in some sense independent actors, again a distinct locus of decisions and state. And moreover, they should have some constraints on their capacities or powers. This one is often overlooked. Agents cannot produce effects at a great distance in general. Their effects are limited by physics, et cetera, et cetera. So identifying carefully the constraints on the entities that you've chosen as agents is very important. Another clue is that if the entity has a life cycle, if it's created, if it lives, if it dies, it's generally a good candidate for being an agent. And in choosing agents, we also accommodate the fact that they have imperfections. Agents generally have inaccurate sensors, they're noisy, their actions are not always effective, or their actions are indeterminate in that an action could produce one of many effects. Generally, the agents have an incomplete model of the environment. In some sense, their experience or their basis of their decisions is incomplete or flawed. Their decision modules may have noise in them as well, mistakes. Another aspect sometimes found is that agents will degrade under stress, under load. Again, they have finite capacities. So usually we use probabilistic methods to capture these imperfections. Now, another aspect of choosing your primitive agent types is identifying whether or not you have a homogeneous population in which a single type of agent inhabits the environment, or you have a heterogeneous population in which there are many different kinds of agents that interact in different ways. So in a lot of simulations, you'll find people interacting with machines in organizations, simulations of animals and microorganisms for disease studies, robots, computers and software, organizations, cities, countries. So many different possible types of agents and at many different levels. The material distinctions between agent types is very important to capture. Agent types should differ in their behavior, actions, states, qualities, capacities. In some material sense, the agents should be distinct from one another. In other words, they should form a well-formed class of entities. But they also more than likely have common characteristics that enable their inhabitation of the particular environment that they've shared. For example, in real space simulations, they're going to have some sense of movement, locomotion, regardless of what type of agent they are. And once you've identified the kinds of agent or the primitive agents, you begin to look at various compositions or aggregations of these agents at the next level. Composite agents are agents that have some sort of part-whole relationship with other agents. In other words, you consider it an agent at a higher level that has as components other agents. In this case, component agents typically have pretty well-defined roles in the composite. For example, if you're modeling an organization as a higher level agent, its components may be, let's say it's a department, it may be people in the department, the manager of the department, the administrative assistants of the department, various workers that are related to the domain of the department. So they would be component agents that have a well-defined role. And if your job was to understand the interactions among different departments in a higher level organization, you might model each department with the primitive human agents, but also treat the department as a higher level abstraction, an agent in and of itself, which will interact with other departments. Aggregations are very simple collections of agents, generally bound by some sort of coherence relation. So it's some sort of collection that holds together based on the phenomenon or the characteristics or the location, common location of the agents, et cetera, et cetera. And again, organizations are typically aggregations of agents of different types. The most common kind of aggregation you're going to find are simple populations. And those are just collections of agents of the same type. A lot of time you want to put agents of different types in an environment and run the simulation and then look at the characteristics of the population as a whole. Take statistics or count or measure in some other sense aspects of the population. Now, this sort of thing can go on recursively if you need to produce higher levels of abstraction to capture higher level phenomenon. So you can have compositions of aggregations of composites, in general multiple layers. But at the bottom you want to have these well-defined primitive agents with behaviors that are straightforward to understand in some sense and simple. That will interact to produce the behaviors of the compositions or aggregations. Okay, once you've chosen your agents, and this again, these are not strictly serial, you're going to have to work these somewhat in parallel. You want to identify the behaviors of the agent. Excuse me, the first thing you want to look at is the notion of the state of an agent. In general, you'll probably come up with custom state variables for your agents that capture, in some sense, the phenomenon that you're interested in and ignore every other aspect of the agent. It's pretty typical. Again, it goes back to the old adage in modeling of just enough representation but not too much to keep it simple and understandable. In some sense, you may also, in agent-based modeling, want to capture the state of the agent's knowledge. In other words, it's typical for fairly involved representations of intelligent agents, either human or synthetic, to capture their mental states, what they know based on what they've encountered, what they can learn, et cetera, et cetera. So this is typical, this is maybe exclusive to agent-based modeling. Another thing that is important generally is the state of an agent's health, whether it's a living organism, a human being, or an animal, or a machine. Machines break down, require maintenance, have defects and faults. Those are common themes in using agent-based models to model systems of machines. So once you've determined what state your agent is in, you want to look at the sensorium, that is, what are the inputs that influence the agent's states and thus behaviors. So you want to understand the features of the environment itself that can be sensed, objects in the environment as well as other agents. In general, if there's communication between agents, as in a human simulation, a social simulation, there will be states or qualities of other agents that are communicated to one another through a language. Different agent types may have different modes of communication and go into different states based on the kinds of communication, very common in social or cultural simulations where there's a misunderstanding due to language or interface. There's generally imperfections, noise, if you will, in a very general sense in the sensing process. This makes life interesting for agents, and it's typical for agents to make mistakes or include noise. And last but not least, it's very important to understand that most of these simulations are embedded in some environment where there's a notion of locality. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. So that the sensing is limited to, in some sense, local phenomenon, that is bounded distance or proximity to the entity being sensed. These are not omniscient entities. Finally, you have to determine the action space of the agents. Identify the kinds of effects caused by an agent and the stimuli or state conditions that will trigger those actions and effects, both on the environment and, again, effects on other agents or agent types. And as in the case for sensory apparatus, imperfect actions can have uncertain effects, which you have to capture. And also they can't be effective at anything but local distance. So the effects of action should be limited to local entities, again, bounded distance or proximity, entities in the neighborhood, if you will, of the agent taking the action. Identifying agent interactions is really a central activity to agent-based modeling. The interactions between agents, as we discussed last time, are the root of interesting and emergent behavior. So carefully identifying the interactions is very important. First, you have to capture the notion of what you mean by an encounter or a contact between agents. What is the meaning of encounter or contact and the circumstances? In real space actions, it typically means that agents have moved within a distance or a proximity of one another, or otherwise have a communication link between them. So locality and proximity are very important aspects of modeling agent interactions. Now, encounters between agents may occur between two agents, or there may be a multiplicity of agents involved in a contact. In other words, effects that agents have on one another may be somewhat determined by the number of agents in the region and may have multiple effects on multiple types of agents in that contact. If the environment has non-agent entities, what does it mean for an agent to encounter an object? Typical in games, agents pick things up, carry them around, put them down. There are inert or inanimate obstacles into motion, interference in some sense. And once you determine the nature of the encounter or contact, then you have to decide what actions will be taken by the individual agents that are participating in the interaction. And also, as we stated, the effects that these actions have on the agent states. So the encounter occurs, actions are taken, and the states of the agents or their state variables are changed. Now, one of the issues that's a practical issue in simulation is determining synchronization of action. If you have agents encountering one another, deciding which agent state should be updated and in what order sometimes is an issue. As we stated last time, for large-scale systems, the actions are going to be asynchronous, not just for the reasons of scale, but also there's a notion of independence or autonomy of the agents as well. So you have to be a little careful when identifying agent interactions and modeling them as to how you're going to sample and update the states of the agents involved in the encounter. And in flow systems, for example, you also have to have there's an issue of exchanging quantities, mass objects upon contact as well, and not violating capacity limitations on the various nodes that are involved in the encounter. Another aspect of agent interactions is the notion of symmetry or reciprocity. If the agents have symmetry in their actions, then the encounter produces concomitant effects in each agent. In other words, no agent is dominant in terms of producing the effect. There's reciprocity. It's possible that that there may be asymmetry in the encounters. An agent arrives at a state before another, and because of the order of encounter, the changes in state and effect may be influenced. In general, again, there are constraints that carry through here on capacity, power, scope, effectiveness of an agent. But if you have a heterogeneous environment with many different agent types, then as you build these tables to model their behavior and interactions, you begin to realize that you have to combine them in a combinatorial manner. If they're symmetric, it's going to be combinations type. If there are three types of agents, there'll be agents interacting with their own type, agents interacting with type 2, and agents interacting with type 3, et cetera, et cetera. But remember that you're supposed to be capturing the behavior of these agents in terms of these encounters. If there are multiple encounters where there are three agents involved, then the number of behaviors that you have to capture, especially in rule-based systems, tends to proliferate. So you do have an issue of being able to model and understand all the different types of combinations of encounters. Fortunately, there's modern technology and simulation languages allow you to at least manage these various modules. Okay, and finally, there are sort of modalities of agent interactions. There are really three that find common. Competition, for example. Agents may be in competition with one another in a general sense through their interactions. They consume resources. They compete for rewards in a finite reward system. They may compete for dominance. In general, their actions involve effects that reduce the opportunities, if you will, for other agents. So competition is typical. Another modality is cooperation, where agents encounter one another or have policies or interactions that produce mutual achievement or mutual improvement in their condition. In some sense, the states of the agents are preferred states, and they're achieved through the activities of multiple agents. And finally, there's an issue of coordination, which is distinct from cooperation. Typically, this means that agents are trying to time or schedule their behavior or their activities in time and space, generally to achieve some sort of, in general sense, force multiplication. That is, by careful timing and scheduling, they can achieve a greater effect on the environment or on other agents that improve their conditions. So, continuing with the example of the Neo-Luddite world, here's a succinct table of the types of agents, their actions, their states, and their encounters based on actions. So the insurgents will allow to move. to detonate the bombs they're carrying, and if they're not carrying bombs, to recruit. So they can be in one of three states. They're either in the armed state, they're either in the recon state, or of course they'll be dead. And recall that there's also, because it's a 3D environment, there's a location variable associated with them that identifies where they are, so that proximity and low neighborhood effects can be computed. In terms of encounters and actions, if insurgent is armed and it encounters a counterinsurgent, it detonates. If it's in recon, it encounters a counterinsurgent and identifies the counterinsurgent. If it's in recon and encounters a neutral, it recruits the neutral to become a terrorist with some probability. And if it's armed and encounters a neutral, it detonates. Now again, these actions can be probabilistic in effect, imperfect. Counterinsurgents will move, shoot, or help. Again, they can be patrolling, they can be alarmed, or they can be dead. If a counterinsurgent is alarmed and encounters a neolighted insurgent, it will shoot. If it's alarmed and encounters a neutral, it may or may not shoot. Again, this is a problem with the discrimination aspects of a counterinsurgent and the fact that neutrals and insurgents are embedded in the population and hard to distinguish. If the counterinsurgent is on patrol and encounters either a neutral or a insurgent, can't discriminate, it will attempt to help the entity in terms of for propaganda or relief purposes. The neutrals move, they implore, and they volunteer. Their states can be a pro-insurgency, anti-insurgency, or dead. Pro-insurgent, if they're in the pro-insurgent state and they encounter a counterinsurgent, or I'm sorry, insurgent, they'll volunteer. If they're pro-insurgency and encounter a counterinsurgent, they'll simply implore for help. If they're anti-insurgent, counterinsurgent, they'll implore, and if they're anti-insurgent and they encounter a insurgent, they'll implore as well. So these are all, of course, very notional. There's lots of different ways to capture this sort of thing. This is just one choice based on the limited problem statement that we gave earlier. So we've identified different types of agents. We've looked at their action space. We've looked at their state space. And we've come up with very simple rules for how they encounter and what actions they might take. Now, associated with these actions will be a change in state based on the action itself. So in this case, actions taken by agents in their encounters change the state of other agents. So in this neo-Luddite world, their modes of interactions, it appears obvious that counterinsurgents are in a competitive relationship with insurgents. What's not so obvious is the relationship of neutrals to insurgents. In some sense, the population of neutrals is clearly affected by the insurgents since they're indiscriminate in their terrorist activities. On the other hand, neutrals can be recruited to the insurgent population in some sort of cooperative manner. So this one's that's a little more difficult to understand. In fact, it's sort of at the heart of the complexity of the dynamics of this simulation. Okay, and now we talk about modeling the environments, and we could have done this in reverse order or with modeling agents, or actually concomitantly. You're obviously going to do this concomitantly. But the first thing in terms of the environment is identifying the space in which the agents are embedded. As we talked about location, locality, proximity, distance, connectedness. These are all the important concepts for producing the underlying representation of the environment. This space generally determines how agents encounter one another, how they're connected to one another. Real space, of course, is either two-dimensional or three-dimensional lattice, typically. where there's a concept of distance. But other possibilities, or even in the same simulation, you could also have arbitrary network topologies. You could have moving agents that also have cell phones communication. They're connected through towers. So there could be another graph associated with the environment that has some sort of arbitrary network topology. In a lot of simulations these days, there's discussions of whether the topology is a small worlds system, an Erdos-Renyi graph, scale-free, preferential attachment graph. These are topics that are very important because they can alter the effects of the simulation at scale and change the dynamics of the system under some circumstances. And in general, agents, there's a question of whether agents are going to move in the space or not. If it's physical, if it's a physical space, the laws of physics or physical constraints hold. If it's something like, say, example, the propagation of a worm in a computer network, the notion of movement is not physical and constrained in that sense. It has more to do with the connectivity of the network topology, the various devices in which it moves through. Also, you have to identify the non-agent objects in the environment. A homogeneous environment will have only agents inhabiting the environment. These simulations are much simpler. You don't have different combinations of behaviors. You really only have to determine things like agent-agent interactions, agents of the same type. Heterogeneous environments, again, there are other important objects that inhabit the environment. And agents you have to discuss the interactions of agents with those objects. Objects may be inanimate, but they may have effects on the state of agents and vice versa. Again, things like interference, inanimate objects such as food in the ant simulations or simulations of ecologies. And generally capture only the necessary objects to explore the phenomenon you're looking for, and represent only the necessary characteristics of those objects, so that you don't have a problem with the complexity of representation of the environment. The environments are typically finite. They have to be. There's a finite space, a finite number of nodes in the graph. So identifying the boundaries are important. Open environments have porous boundaries. That is, in some sense, things move back and forth across the boundaries outside of the scope of the agent space or representation. So open environments can exchange matter, energy, information, agents even, objects beyond the boundaries, coming in and out at certain rates. Closed environments do not have porous boundaries, so the simulation is self-contained. And simulation is only concerned with activities within the boundaries, regardless of whether it's open or closed. Now, environments themselves may exhibit phenomenon at various scales. There are effects and events. Environments may capture, in some sense, events on populations of objects. For example, agents moving into a constrained space, say a building. Again, there's interference and constraints, so that if you have a policy where agents are crowded and too dense inside of a building, the environment may create effects on the agents. That is, they're crowded and their behaviors may be influenced in an aggregate sense by environmentally induced effects. And then they may exhibit events at different scales. The environment itself may have features, dynamic features not really attributed to intelligent agents, things like a natural phenomenon, floods, if it's a real space, floods or earthquakes or things like that can affect large populations of agents. And you have to have a modality to capture these in the simulation. It's not necessarily attributed to agents, but it's generally attributed to the interaction of the environment with populations, compositions, or aggregates of agents. Okay, and finally, you have to be very clear on the measurement space for your simulation. You have to decide what are the important global properties, high-level properties of the system that you want to measure. These in general are the macroscopic variables that are intimately related to resolving the problem or measuring the effects on the system as a whole. So you have issues of taking averages, other global statistics, doing your counting, so to speak. It's typical to look at the numbers of agents of different types, or otherwise average or count their capacities, their other state variables. There's also at this point, a notion of some fitness functions that may be a complex function of some quantitative variables of agents of different types. Cost functions are typical. The evaluation of aggregates of agents at the highest level. So generally, impacts on agent populations are captured here, capacity, extinction state, that sort of thing. Moreover, you may want to measure impacts and properties of the inanimate or other objects, non-agent objects in the environment, the levels of resources, the functionality of machines, state of repair. In this case, if you have an open environment, resources may be replenished. If it's closed, they may be finite and decreasing. These resources may be important in terms of the agent behavior, their encounters with objects. Oftentimes you'll want to take a region of the environment, an inanimate object associated with the environment, and compute effects, average properties of agents in a particular neighborhood or locality. In other words, you may have a bounded cluster of agents, an aggregate that whose behavior is measured for some reason. And last but not least, you want to look at phenomenon that may have steady state equilibria, measurements that will indicate the existence of stable states, that is, emergent properties, and moreover, illustrate the important phase transitions that occur at certain states or for certain parameters of the system. So back to the Neo-Luddite example, the environment is a simple 2D lattice. There is a simple movement in our capturing the behavior of the agents. There's no interference or collisions between agents. They merely come into proximity with one another. The population, the environment is homogeneous. There's only agents, counterinsurgents, insurgents, and neutrals. There are no other objects per se in the environment. And the environment is open, as we said. Both counterinsurgents and neutrals can be imported into the environment under some sort of policy. So the measurements that we're concerned with the Neo-Luddite world are the population levels, the amount or number of counterinsurgents, neutrals, and insurgents, or their densities or some other derivative measurement. But for the neo-Luddite world, where victory conditions for counterinsurgents have very much to do with population levels or the first derivative rate of change of population levels of insurgents and neutrals. The kind of parameters that we might want to notionally capture in the neo-Luddite world are the troop surge level. This is how many counterinsurgents are being introduced into the environment from the external sources. This, of course, is a policy, a military policy. The detection probability of the insurgents, that is, the ability of a counterinsurgent when contacting an insurgent to detect that it's an insurgent. The false positive probability, the ability of a counterinsurgent to or the mistake, I should say, that a counterinsurgent makes in detecting an insurgent. The rate of recruitment after end deaths, this is an issue for the neutrals. Again, the phenomenon that we observe is that that after events in which neutrals die, there's an alteration of recruitment rate. Well, there should be some rate variable or parameter associated with this. The constant rate of recruitment, what is the political variable associated with the neutrals' anger at being in an occupied country? Blast radius is a physical parameter. Again, we want to capture this because in the problem statement it indicated that the insurgents were innovating by using larger bombs. It's an adaptive system again, and that the counterinsurgency must itself adapt to the adaptation and the behaviors or policies of the insurgent population. The accuracy of shooting is probably something that's an issue, since the counterinsurgents accidentally shooting neutrals is a source of problem with the neutral population. This is a brief overview of some of the issues of design and analysis of agent-based modeling systems. In the next part, Shannon Spires is going to introduce you to the simulation of the neo-Luddite world. I've done the barest of introduction, but it's our feeling at this point that it's probably good to continue with the example and go into more detail about how you would actually capture in the NetLogo tool some of the concepts that we've begin to discuss about the simulation.
Hi, I'm Shannon Spires, and I'm going to finish up this lecture with some illustration of some of the models that we've built in the past. I'm going to start, before we get into the neo-Luddite model, with some robotic models that we've built. This is a simulation of robots where several robots are designed to be deployed into the field to search for, let's say, for example, landmines. And you want to drop some number of small-wheeled mobile robots out into an area to search for landmines. And if you look at this window, the very first thing you see here is that we've got several dots that represent robots. And this is, in effect, a plan view, an aerial view of several robots that could potentially have been dropped out of an airplane to scour an area for landmines. Now, these robots have limited battery power. They can't run forever. Furthermore, if they hit a landmine and explode, then they're obviously no longer of any use. So the question becomes, how do you drop several of these robots out of an airplane to search an area for landmines and yet have the mission complete, even if several of the robots get destroyed, or if some of the robots become defective, or if the robots run out of battery power. And one way we came up with to solve this problem is to have them search a space-filling curve. Now, each robot has, in addition to limited power, limited sensory capability. The way they sense the landmines is that they have a magnetometer underneath their bodies, and when they get very close to a landmine, they detect that it's there. Of course, sometimes they'll run over it. But the point is they can't determine where the landmines are from a distance. They actually have to get very close to them. So as Dr. Goldsmith mentioned this morning, the robots are limited in their capability. They're limited in their sensory range. They're limited in their power. They're not omniscient. And furthermore, they're limited in their communication capability, although they do have some communication here in that they can communicate with their neighboring robots. They can communicate with the other robots in the field, but we don't want to require that communication to be high bandwidth. We want them to be as autonomous as possible with very little information being exchanged, yet we want them to accomplish the mission. So the way we came up with to do this is to have the robots follow a space-filling curve. When the robots land on the ground, they can immediately coordinate their positions using GPS, and now all the robots know where all the other robots are located. But they don't really need to do any further communication after that. And at this point, the robots can decide that they're on in this case, a Hilbert curve, which is a canonical space-filling curve. As you can see, this is what the curve looks like when it's done. And you can think of this as a closed path. Topologically, this is a circle. But of course, it's a lot more intricate than that. But in any case, the robots can follow this curve and cover every point on the space to some required resolution. The other attribute of this is that if one or more of the robots get destroyed, then the robot behind that one simply continues on. So this is a way to kind of very quickly divide up the space into roughly 1/n parts, where we have n robots. In this case, we have 10. And yet all the robots can do roughly the same amount of work, 1/10 the amount of work roughly that one robot would have to do. But it's still robust, and it still guarantees that the objects of interest have been found. So let's extend this a little higher. So let's assume that the robots have a much more limited sensory range, and we'll use a lot more robots. And to do this, all we do is increase the order of the space-filling curve. So here we have 100 robots. They're all in different colors so that we can track them more easily. And we'll start them running so you can see the path that they follow. They're all on the same space-filling curve, only now we've got the space-filling curve at a much higher resolution, probably a little more realistic of an area that the robots might want to search. And again, each robot leaves a path behind itself in its own color so that we can kind of see where the colors are. But the robots get dropped randomly, for example, from an airplane. And the nice quality is that they all search roughly the same amount of area. And if any one or more of them gets blown up, the other robot behind can fill in, and not a lot of reconfiguration has to happen to make that work. So it's a good example of how you can use a lot of robots, a lot of agents with limited sensory capabilities and limited power, limited communication capabilities to accomplish a larger mission in a robust fashion. Now we have another example of a similar algorithm, which we call alpha beta. And in this case, we have another cluster of robots that uses a different algorithm. This is not a space-filling curve. In this case, the robots are down here in the lower right corner, and the different colors represent 3 different kinds of robots. In this case, we have a red robot, and there's only one of those. That's called the null alpha, green robots that are called alphas, and blues that are called betas. Now, the way this works is all the robots have the capability of sensing something at a distance. In this case, the target they're looking for is right in the center of the screen. And it could be, for example, a smoke plume. But the robots don't have any vision capability in this case. They only have smell capability, as it were. So then the question becomes, how do we find this smoke plume using robots that can in some way sense the smell the smoke, smell the particles in the smoke? How do we make sure that all the robots can work collectively to do this? Well, we could use a hill climbing technique, which is that whenever the robot gets the sensation of a smell that he's interested in, he tends to go toward the gradient that makes that smell larger. And that works only very well in theory, because in practice you tend to run into cases where there's what we call local minima. There are places where the wind could blow the smoke around and all of a sudden the robot could lose the sensation of the smell. There could be more than one smell, one smoke plume, more than one smoke plume, and that could confuse a hill climbing algorithm. So we don't want to just do a blind gradient search for this. What we want to do instead is do something a little bit more clever. So in this case, what we did was program the lead robot, which we call the alpha, to be the one that senses the smell the most strongly. And it's interesting here because the lead robot can change all the time. At every iteration, whichever robot has the strongest sense of smell at that particular time becomes the lead. So the red robot here, which is the lead robot, can change all the time. Whoever's red changes. And the green robots are what we call alpha robots. They tend to try to follow and explore for a stronger scent. And if one of them gets a stronger scent, it becomes the alpha, the lead. And then the blue robots have as their only mission to go towards the alpha. And because the alpha changes at any given time, they can change the direction that they're going toward. So the description of the algorithm is fairly straightforward and it's fairly easy to code up. I guess the point is that these agents are relatively simple. They don't have a whole lot of processing capability. They don't have a lot of communications capability. And yet they can perform a mission that one robot couldn't do simply because they're operating in a collective. And they have interactions with each other that are in and of themselves simple, but they exhibit much more complicated behavior when we put them together in a collective. So now I'm going to show you a movie that we made where we put both of these algorithms together. As I said, the Hilbert algorithm is one where the robots can sense something, but only if it's very close by. The alpha-beta algorithm, which is what we call this one, is one where the robots can sense things at a distance, but they may or may not have a very strong signal at any given time. So let's say we wanted to combine both of these. And when we first drop the robots out of the airplane, they have no sensation of anything at a distance whatsoever. So the only option they have is to sort of do a blind search until one or more of them get some kind of a scent of the smoke plume that they're interested in. And as soon as one of them gets that sensation, we can switch into the other mode of operation. So this is going to be an illustration of, this is a fancy 3D version of this, but this will illustrate a collective of robots operating with a complete change of algorithm. We'll start out with the Hilbert algorithm, they'll switch to the alpha-beta algorithm, and they'll end up finding the smoke plume. And even though, this is kind of a showy computer graphics rendering of what's going on, it really was built with the behaviors that we had programmed into these robots from the beginning. So we haven't done any fudging here to make the behavior look better than it really is. So I'm going to turn off the sound here because it's not necessary. But you can see now we have an airplane that's flying over some region where we want to find mines, and it drops the robots by parachute. They land on the ground in random locations. Each of them has a battery and a transmitting antenna, and they each figure out where they are using GPS, and they relay those coordinates to each other. But then after that, they really don't have to do a whole lot of communication. So as soon as they hit the ground, they start moving in the Hilbert space-filling curve manner. Since they don't have any other sensation, this is all they can do to try to get an initial reading of the space. There's one of them, still tracing out the space-filling curve. And now you can see that robot's behavior has changed. In fact, all of the robot's behaviors changed at the same time, because as soon as one of them got the sensation of the smoke plume, they relayed that information to each other. And the algorithm completely changed. They threw out the Hilbert search mechanism and went to the alpha-beta search mechanism. Because now that they've got a sensation, they can search much more efficiently by going towards the target. So the dot near the center of the screen is the plume that they're after. And you can see they're headed toward it, but not directly, because they're still following the alpha-beta algorithm. Whichever robot has the strongest sensation at any given time essentially stands still and the other robots follow it. So the fact that they're not following the smoke plume directly is indicative of the fact that there is some noise in this algorithm. It's not perfect, but it's a heck of a lot better than an average hill climbing algorithm would be, because almost certainly the robots would get stuck in a local minimum if that were the algorithm of use right here. So they eventually do find it. And again, this is an illustration of simple algorithms on individual robots, resulting in complicated behavior when you have a bunch of robots operating in a collective with interesting interactions between them and between them and the outside world. So that's the end of this lecture. In the next lecture, I'll go into the Neo-Luddite problem and another simulation environment that you can use for both the Neo-Luddite problem and your homework assignments for several of the following lectures in this series. Thanks.